squat. Testing, here we go, ready, here we are. We're there? Okay, that's probably good, yeah. Great, that's our sound check for the evening. Welcome everybody, glad to see you here. This is the second installment of People's Economics. I'll be talking about work in the next economy. Thought about a lot of different ways of describing this. Labor, work, employment. Really, it's about work. There's always work to be done. And that's the key, is there is always work to be done. Sometimes it's not as well paid as others, and that's kind of the whole situation. If you remember, the basic premise of all of this is that the free market is what we're looking at, first and foremost. I didn't get too many comments on it. I was a little bit surprised. When we talk about where things are going or where everything went wrong, a lot of people like to focus on particular political administrations. You know, it's all Ronald Reagan's fault. It's all George W. Bush's fault. I don't go there. There are certain things that are going on in the economy that maybe we don't respond to as well as we should, but there are things that are just happening. And that's what we need to be aware of. And that's what I like to talk about more than anything, because I think if we are more aware of it, the politics will settle itself out. And that's always been my perspective, is what the free market is looking for. Last time we talked about cycles in American economic life, political life. You didn't see this graph. I wasn't going to throw this at you. I'm just going to do it real quickly. But the idea that there have been about 4 cycles that were at roughly the end of roughly the fifth depression in American history. If you look up Kondratiev waves, we talked about Nikolai Kondratiev and his economic theories of cycles. You'll get a lot of really interesting stuff like this. Just, go with it and deal with it some. But the main message that I tried to get across was that spring is coming. We're in the middle of a winter right now, an economic winter, and that spring is coming. And that's part of what I want to describe tonight, is what that looks like at the end of the winter as we head into the spring. What we plant is what we harvest. And right now, we're kind of living off of the end of that last post-war cycle that's completed itself, but we're entering a new cycle that's going to have something better for everybody. So, yeah, the problem with looking at it in the long run, this is why economists are never invited to parties, okay? Right there, you can just see. Economics isn't really a lot of fun. And that's the problem with the long run, is that in the long run, we're all dead, as John Maynard Keynes. In fact, the best economists are somewhat famous for taking away the beer before the party even starts. Yeah. We're about to raise interest rates, aren't we? And that's when things will get interesting. So when you talk about the long run, we do have to kind of keep it with a grain of salt, because if everything works out with the free market in the long run, we have to remember that we all have this nasty habit of eating every day, or getting sick once in a while, or things like that. So this is the one flaw that I have to say when we look coming out of the last week's presentation on the long run. Remember that it doesn't exactly explain everything, and it doesn't give us everything. But what we want to talk tonight, before I get into employment, is the thing that has really dominated sort of the end of this economic cycle. And that's the advance of technology. Okay? Not just technology available in the world, technology for everybody. That's what this guy was all about, bringing it to the masses. Made a lot of money, got a big reputation as a messiah, promising us a world which would be technology driven, and how wonderful that might be. But I have a tendency to look to somebody else and another dead white guy's prophecy about how things would be. And Kurt Vonnegut. Many people don't remember this because it was his first novel. Didn't have all of his usual style and flair yet. From 1952. It was a very important novel, actually, in a lot of different ways. It was called Player Piano. And in that world, Kurt Vonnegut, who studied to be an engineer, by the way, Didn't quite work out for him. He didn't have an engineer's mind, but he was more of a writer, but he still kind of was entranced by the idea of engineering. He envisioned a world where if you didn't have an engineering degree, there was basically no employment for you. You either wound up in the army or in what he called the Reconstruction and Reclamation Corps, the Reeks and Recs that went around fixing up highways and so on around, because there was nothing else for people to do if you weren't an engineer. This was written in 1952, before Steve Jobs was even born. Okay? It's a different vision of the world, a dystopia. And I think it's very important because there's a lot of what Kurt Vonnegut had to say at that time that speaks more clearly to what happened in our world today than that vision of a technology-driven utopia. And I think that's going to be proven to be very important. And this is what I think it really all comes down to. And I want to start with this, because this is a graph of the total amount of percent of the economy that winds up going for salaries. Okay? And if you look at it, way back here in the post-war era, it was right about 50%, give or take more or less. Half of the benefits of the economy went to salaries, the other half went to what? Profits for corporations, to the people who put up the money and so on. And then it just starts falling off a cliff. Right in here, sometime in the 1970s. See, not everything is cyclical. There is this long-term thing that we need to take into account as well. Because something changed in the 1970s. Those halcyon days of the post-war era something was a little bit different. If that chart didn't show it very well, this is if you look at the title up there, it's a little complicated because I wanted to make sure you saw all the math that went into it. This is the total compensation for all employees adjusted for inflation. And it shows you that inflection point really clearly. Something happened in the 1970s. And yeah, we came back most of the way. But again, as a share of the total product in the economy, something fell off a cliff. It used to be a 50-50 share. 50% of the economy went to workers, 50% went to capital. It's now down to 43%, a difference of about $1 trillion a year, or about $9,000 per household. This is a very important number. If we had the same arrangement that we had back in the early post-war era, there would be a difference of about $9,000 per household total. Okay? Remember back in the Leave It to Beaver era, that's basically what they were looking at. American workers got half of the spoils, the capital got the other half. And the difference is about $1 trillion a year. So what happened in the 1970s? I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with the cycles we talked about. That doesn't have anything to do with politics and all that. Sometime around 1974, Nixon resigned. We had the OPEC crisis. It's really hard to fit in historically, but we can look at something big that happened. This is a graph of the civilian labor force participation rate. Basically, over here we've got the percentages of the total number of people over 16 years of age that are eligible to work, the percentage of them that are working. And you've probably seen this from a lot of people. Look at that, it's going straight down. From 2000, fewer and fewer people are working all the time as a percent of the economy. We're in trouble. I mean, that's what that says, right? Fewer people are working all the time. Once again, let's take a long view on that. Let's pull this chart back a little bit, all the way to that Leave It to Beaver era. You notice that before the 1970s, there was never more than 60% of the people who were adults, over 16 years of age anyway, were working. And suddenly, sometime in the 1970s, everything took off. We're at 62% now. It hasn't fallen. It's still above this magic number of 60%. We still have more people in the economy than we did back in that golden age of tail fins on cars and things like that. So what happened? I mean, what caused this relationship to change? I'll tell you what changed. The baby boomers entered the workforce, and in particular, women started working. This is where it gets difficult as a white guy to talk about, okay? Because I'm not trying to say that women need to get out of the workforce. It's a historical fact. Women needed to enter the workforce. I had the picture of Janet Yellen earlier. Isn't it great that the most powerful person in the whole world is a woman? I mean, maybe a year from now, the second most powerful person in the world will be a woman too. I don't know. But we know that the Times Person of the Year was Angela Merkel. Okay, we're not going backwards on this. In fact, let's go back one on this. Just leave it. We're not going backwards on women in the workforce. What we are, but we have to figure out how we're going to absorb it. We have to figure out what's going to change to make this economy work. Because as you saw, during that golden period, there was never more than about 60% of the adults were working. And when something went wrong was about the time that more than 60% entered the workforce. Now here's another way of looking at it. This is the same chart starting in 1968, so it's blown up a little bit. This is about the time that we entered one of those economic periods that was difficult. The blue line is the one you saw before, the civilian participation rate. The red line is what we call the Gini index. It's a measure of income inequality. Notice it also goes up from about the same time. We don't have much data before that, but the Gini index is an important thing. What it is at 0 is perfect income inequality. Everybody earns the same thing. At 100, it means that one person earns absolutely everything. So
we're on the way.
Yeah, you know, some sort of dictatorship or kingdom where they get everything. So as that goes up, that's a measure of income inequality, and you see that it's growing during that whole time that the workforce participation rate is going up. This is Corrado Gini.
Is that like Cuba? That backslide is everybody's. It's like Cuba.
Well,
dictatorship, you said, right? I mean,
well, yeah. If one person owns absolutely everything, then the Gini index would be at 100 for things. This is a picture of Corrado Gini. If you remember the last time I talked about Kondratiev, the father of business cycles, which are well accepted on Wall Street these days, was a dedicated communist. Kind of ironic. Corrado Gini, the father of income inequality measurement and understanding income inequality, this guy was the statistician for Mussolini. Okay? Part of the point here being you never know where you're going to get into some interesting things, all right? You just got to keep your eyes open, and that's the key, I think, to new perspectives in the world. But one of the things that we find by taking a graph here of the labor force participation rate in all the developed countries, plus Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRIC nations, and plotting them with their Gini coefficient, okay, the measure of income inequality, you get this amazing straight line. Basically, there is only so much work to go around in a developed or developing economy. The more people that enter the workforce, the lower the wages for them. Okay? This is a bit of a surprising result, and no one seems to like to talk about it, but it's been proven true time and time again. In a developed nation, there is only so much work to go around, so much paid work. And that's the important difference. I mean, if you need to mow your lawn, for example, you can go out and mow your lawn. Or if you go pay the neighbor kid 20 bucks to mow your lawn, that's a job. How much are you willing to give up of your time to pay the neighbor kid or whoever, the lawn service that comes in or whatever? That's the difference in how much paid work there is. There's always work to be done, but only some of it gets money. And if you put all of the nations that have a substantial income on one chart, you will find that income inequality rises with more people in the workforce. This is very consistent that there is only so much paid work to go around. You see one outlier here? That's Germany. For some reason, Germany has a pretty high labor force participation rate, but really good income inequality. We'll get to that one later, okay? Because Germany is doing something right, and exactly what is worth discussing separately. So how did we get there? Here's another chart. This talk is pretty heavy with charts, but I wanted to show a chart of productivity, which is simply the total amount of output per worker. The total output of the economy divided by the total number of workers and what happens to it. And you can see the post-war era, that first spring that we talked about up until 1965, it was rising at about $1,200 every year. More productivity from each worker.
Is that corrected for inflation?
And corrected for inflation, yes, real gross domestic product.
Got it,
Economists use the term real to describe inflation adjusted, which is to say not real. Then we hit that summer period that I talked about before, 1965 to 1982. It flattened out, only $300 per year gain in productivity. And then it took right back off, another $1,200 per year in real inflation, 2015 adjusted numbers. And then something weird happened. Here in 2000, if this was really a depression, if this was really an economic winter, it kept going. Productivity kept going through the roof. How did that take place if we're supposedly in a depression? That's the weird part of it, and I'll explain it to you. Because we lost workers. Productivity gains came at the expense of losing workers. You remember this Apple commercial from 1984, the promise that Steve Jobs had for all of us, that we'd have greater productivity through the internet? I mean, just think about it. We don't have to worry about shuffling paper anymore. We can just send emails to each other. We can have files on a server. Well, there was a time when an awful lot of people made a living shuffling paper. They don't have jobs anymore. And I'll tell you right now, yesterday's productivity gains are today's unemployment. And that's one of the pitfalls of a technology-driven economy. When you have people's jobs being replaced by technology, you wind up with that situation where productivity keeps growing. There's more and more output per worker, but who's getting it? We used to have that relationship where it was 50% to the workers. It's not anymore. It's now down to 43%. $1 trillion a year is going not to the workers based on the traditional arrangement that we had in the early days of the post-war economy. It's going instead to the owners of capital. And that's a big change. You can also look at this in terms of the minimum wage. Now this chart is a lot more complicated, but from the post-war era to about 1981, the minimum wage adjusted for productivity, adjusted for inflation, everything. Totally in today's terms, the minimum wage in the post-war period was about $16 an hour. Now, something changed about 1981. This is a political decision. We decided to stop adjusting the minimum wage and keeping pace with things, but it's settled into a new kind of regime. It's a little more noisy, where it's more like $8 in today's money. Over the whole period, it comes out at about 12. You know, the fight for $15 an hour minimum wage, the arguments in favor of that and all, you could argue for 16. And I went into doing this analysis, not convinced that $15 an hour minimum wage was justified, but where you get that from is under the old arrangement from prior to the 1980s, prior to that period when workers' share of the economy fell off, the minimum wage was indeed set at a share of the product of this economy, adjusted for inflation and everything, at something around $16 an hour. Okay, that's how far we've fallen to the $7.50 we have today. That's the big difference that we're looking at in terms of what workers are getting. So we have all of these forces that are converging on workers. We have competition from too many people in the workforce. We have automation that is basically taking people's jobs away because we don't need them anymore. We can do things through the internet, through automation. And we also have a higher overhead. That's going to be something that needs a little more explanation, I think. Something that I don't talk about much, because I think it's been talked to death, is globalization. A lot of people will tell you, hey, you know, people in India are ready to take your job. They get paid a lot less in India. I'll tell you what, first of all, that's a story that's told by people who want to lower wages, all right? That's a scare tactic as far as I'm concerned. Germany is doing very well as a developed nation, paying their workers pretty well, and they don't have an income inequality problem. The workers are still getting their share. Finland is getting its share. We'll get a little bit to Finland later. Other countries are doing very well. That's not the main issue. In terms of those other forces on American workers, this is a graph of births by year. If you look at it right now, next year, 2016, that part of the baby boom is going to start turning 65 and retiring. The competition on workers is going to go down. And that's a lot of the reason why that graph of worker participation is turning down. It's going to go back to 60%. That part is going to fix itself largely. We're going to actually have a shortage of workers as all of these people born in these years start retiring. And that's why things changed sometime around 2017 when I said spring is really coming. Yeah. All these guys are going to start retiring. Now, not everybody's going to retire at 65, but still, on average, the median year for retirement is 65 years of age. Some people retire earlier, some people later, but it works out in the laundry somewhere around 65. The competition for jobs is going down, and that's a big part of the recovery that we're already seeing right now. But then there's the other part of it, and that is the flexible workforce. Because right now, 21% of all workers are working on a contract basis. Me too. That's what I do. I've been a freelancer for longer than I'd like to think, actually, for at least 10 years at this point. And that's expected to rise. It's going to keep rising. See, the free market finds solutions to all these kinds of things. Okay? Part of what's driving that is the overhead per employee, which is a very important point. You know, the average American worker makes about $20 an hour, which is to say about 40 grand a year. Okay? That's what they get in a salary. But that's not what their employer pays. According to the Department of Labor, there's a 42% overhead that's required by law and tradition and all that. One of the biggest parts we see is insurance there. That's including your health benefits. They come from your employer. But there's all this other stuff that comes in. Legally required benefits, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation insurance, all kinds of different things that come into it. This, as the way the Department of Labor counts it, doesn't even include training, doesn't even include the workspace that employee takes up. There is a tremendous amount of overhead for every employee. That employee that makes $40,000 a year, to their employer, it costs at least, at a minimum, $58,000. And if you add in training and other things on top of it, okay, that's what we really have to deal with in terms of our competitive position. Going on from there, we have some real questions in an age of automation about whether or not there is a skills gap. Do workers not have the skills necessary to compete in the new economy? Now, this is a very complicated curve. I'm going to spend some time on it. It's called the Beverage Curve, which is a really good time to stop and have a tasty beverage if you haven't had one before. Yes. Actually, it's named after Lord Beveridge. He was the principal economist who helped engineer the post-war recovery in the United Kingdom. Nothing related to beer, but it's still a good time to have beer. There's never a bad time. What it shows is, for every job opening, what the unemployment rate is. The more job openings, the lower you expect the unemployment rate to be. And you just start graphing all those things, month by month. All these lines that are not blue are before 2008. And blue picks up, or kind of purpley, picks up after 2008. And you'll see that they form a different curve, as it were. They occupy a different space. There's a difference of about 1.5% unemployment, give or take, between the two. Why is that? Well, companies might be slow to hire people, but also they might not be finding the right number of people. So at any given number of job openings, we have a higher unemployment than we might otherwise. 1.5%, that's about 2 million people that may not have the right skills for this new economy. And that's very important because one of the features of a depression is that the old economy has been destroyed. Winter has set in, it's gone to sleep. A new economy is born in its place. So what do we need to have a flexible workforce in the future? We need to reduce that overhead per employee, okay? Workers in Germany and these other industrialized nations that are doing just fine in the global economy, those companies don't have to pay health care, okay? Those companies don't have to pay all of the kinds of taxes and other things that our companies have to pay. We are hobbling ourselves by taxing those various things and putting requirements on them. Separating healthcare from employment is something that every other industrialized nation has done. We also need to keep bridging the skills gap with continuous learning. And if we're really going to have a flexible workforce with everybody working on contract, we need to have protections for those workers. And honestly, I don't like having a bunch of text up here, but I really think that these 4 points define what work is going to be like in the next economy. But what really I think it comes down to is that we're going to have to go to a world where we tax profit and not labor. Right now we have the 7.62% FICA that comes out of every paycheck. And if you're self-employed, there's another 7.62%, or everybody, it comes out of everybody. But if you're self-employed like me, it's called the self-employment tax. We tax and put a lot of things on labor rather than having it come out of profits, as other industrialized nations, our competitors, do. And I think that that's the real watchword for what we're going to have to wind up doing in the next economy. But this is where it gets interesting, because right now, tomorrow morning at 9:30, you see the date up there, the Department of Labor is having a conference on the future of work, and they're going to be discussing this very thing. Just like we're talking about here tonight, all of the best and brightest minds who are interested in labor in this country are gathering in Washington, D.C. Just think about it. The night before conference, they're probably having a few beers, right? They're getting together, a bunch of economists having a party. Okay, nobody invites economists to parties. That was the lesson. But the point is, it's going to be something that this is a very hot topic, because the future of work and how we figure out that new economy that is clearly going towards a flexible workforce that is skilled, that doesn't have a tremendous amount of overhead, that can come and go as employers need it, but equally important, how families need it to go so that they can stay home and take care of the kids. That's the key for the future. And you know, if you wonder how we're going to get ourselves down to a point where there are fewer workers competing for jobs and puts upward pressure on wages for a change, working 30 hours a week or so is one way to do it. Probably the best way to do it. And that's something that is definitely going to happen. And definitely is happening already in this economy. So, one final thought. This came through just the other day. Finland, one of those wonderful developed nations, the nation that gave us Nokia and Sisu, not the skis, the concept. Okay? Finland is proposing to just scrap the entire benefits system they have and give everybody a guaranteed income of 800 euros a month, about 10,000 euros a year. It's an interesting number, isn't it? Because that's exactly where in our economy, what I told you was the difference, that gap of what workers aren't making that they used to back in our golden age. It kind of comes out about the same level. Now this would be very expensive for us to do. If we were to go all the way where Finland went here, this would cost us about $3 trillion a year. It's a big number. But we could get to the point where we're doing it for each household, have a guaranteed income of something, where money is redistributed, and scrap all of the other social programs in here and go that direction. It's a lot more radical, but I think the point is that some kind of social arrangement is going to have to change, no matter how we look at it. If we're doing nothing more than counting on people to retire, that means they're eligible for Social Security and Medicare. Somebody's got to pay for that, okay? Just given our current system, there is going to be a tighter social arrangement no matter what we do. The question becomes how we figure out how to do it and really look towards the future of labor, which the free market has already decided both businesses and a lot of employees of a younger generation want that flexible workforce, want that flexibility. And that's going to only put upward pressure on wages if we make that happen. Now, next week, we're going to talk more about high finance. As I said, I skipped over globalization for a very good reason, because I believe that this is a financial problem in terms of offshoring jobs and things like that. It has a lot more to do with the value of the dollar. And high finance has a lot to do with employment, because again, we used to have a 50-50 split between workers and the financial world, and that's now 57-43, and that makes a big difference. What are these guys doing with that extra 7% if it's not going to workers? And that's what we're going to talk about next week at the same time. And that's my talk for the night. I bet you have a lot of questions.
Jesus, don't we?